to finish the second to last parak of Bava Batra. Today's Kuf Nun Tet Amin Aleph Chodesh Tov, and we are going to finish parak Mishameh today. Yesterday we started a discussion which we are going to continue today. I told you we'd take half the daf, which is that they sent over statements of halacha from Eretz Yisrael. They're called Shalchu Mitam. They sent from there, and these were all kinds of different principles. And they said about this, this is what's kasheh b'dinei mamanut. It's very hard. It's very hard to understand. It's illogical, essentially, but it's true, but it's illogical. So we quoted a couple cases, and we said these are the ones it's referring to, but then each one we came to understand was pretty logical. So if it's logical, it's true, but it doesn't fit the criteria. So we're today up to the next case, which is, I'm going to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 lines from the top, around a third of the way down. Elai kashya hakashya. If there's a hard case, now here doesn't mean a question. It means a hard case about dinei mamanut. This is the case. And now the first word on the line is haya yodea lo edut b'shtar. Let's say there's a case where a person, I'll pick a name, Ruvain, testifies that on a shtar that Shimon borrowed money from Levi, right? So he wrote Shimon borrowed $1,000. Ruvain is the witness, and he testifies in the shtar, I signed and I saw it. And 2 years later, 3 years later, they come to collect, right? So they have to establish, are the witnesses good witnesses? So hayodea lo edut b'shtar, a person knows the edut, meaning they wrote their signature in the shtar, ad shelo na'aseh gazlan, before they became a crook. But then subsequently, Ruvain stole and went to jail and whatever, and he now is no longer reliable. And now Naseh Gazlan. So now if you come to Ruvain and say, did you sign the shtar? And he says, yeah, that's my signature. You're not going to trust him because he's completely unreliable now, right? He's a liar. He lost his reputation. Maybe, even though he says that's my signature, which usually you believe a person to say, this guy, maybe he's making it up, or maybe he lied about the date in the shtar. Or maybe he signed it yesterday and wrote 3 years ago, because that's very advantageous. So you can't trust anything he says right now. But if you go to somebody else and say, can you recognize that signature? Is it Ruvain's signature? And they say, yes, I recognize it. And the date on the shtar is 3 years ago when he wasn't a Gazlan yet, then presumably you would believe the shtar. So this is a very weird case where you believe someone else about his signature, you don't even believe him. So in that case, hu eino me'id al ktav yado, he cannot testify about his signature, aval achirim me'idin, but others can. And this seems very contradictory. Hashta iu lo mehemin, he's not believed about himself, achrini mehemni, about him, right? The other people can't say they saw the loan. They can say, we can verify that this is Ruvain's signature. So this seems to be zuhi shekasheh b'dinei mamanut. This is a hard point, meaning a difficult to understand rule in dinei mamanut, because it seems very counterintuitive that you're trusting someone about a third party who you wouldn't even trust themselves. Says, well, that's not true, because maybe I mean, the case I gave you is true, but maybe what happened here was something very different. My kushya dilma, maybe, meaning maybe all they said was in a case in a case where they had a chazakah of the ktav yado b'beit. If you recall, this is very important to remember this, because we're not going to have it again for a long, long time, is that when, very often a person would have a document that would say they owed money, right? And someone would want to establish that this document is verified. So you can testify about a document without recreating the loan. Ruvain shows up in town with the shtar, or let's say Shimon, that says he borrowed money or he lent money to Levi, right? And he's got witnesses. Now he's afraid his witnesses might die. That happens to witnesses sometimes, right? Or they'll go away, or they'll travel. So you can go to the court and you can say, I want to establish in front of the court today that these witnesses are who they say they are. They're here, or someone here knows them, and this is their signature, and this is a verified document. So that if in 10 years from now, when I come to collect my loan, I can't find Ruvain, or I can't find the other witnesses, at least I have proof that it's a verified document. And that is called a henpick, right? That shtar is called a henpick. So we've had this many times in Bava Batra. We don't really have it anywhere else, to be honest, after Bava Batra. But for a long time, till we get back to Nezikin, probably, we're not going to have this concept, but that might be what happened. So that in 2020, let's say, Ruvain signed the shtar. In 2021, they came to court and said, this is really Ruvain's signature. The next year, he became a thief, right? So now you don't trust him anymore, but you already verified this thing. And now, of course, today, you can't have him come and say, oh, that was my signature, because he's not reliable. But you have someone else who could come and say, we were there in 2021 or whatever, and they verified it. So let's read that inside. It says the Gemara, maybe Kigon Shuchzak Tav Yado Beit Din, that they actually already upheld this in Beit Din. Ella ikashia akash. But if you have a problem of a ruling, here's a problematic ruling. This is the next case. We're up to like the fifth case by now. Hayodelo edu b'shtar. Let's say a person is a witness in a shtar. Ad shelo tipolo birusha. Let's say Ruvain is a very distant cousin of Levi, right? So he's allowed to testify for Levi. He's not a first cousin, or he's not a first degree relative. Sorry, he's first cousin could. He's not a relative who couldn't testify. Distant relative, right? Great nephew, let's say. I don't know. So he, Levi, right, has a shtar that says that he lent money to Shimon, right? That Levi is the lender, Shimon's the borrower. Ruvain signed the shtar. Turns out that before Levi collects this money, Levi dies and there's a plague and his whole family dies, his whole village dies, whatever it might be. Ruvain, this eighth cousin, it becomes his inheritor. But of course, Ruvain signed the shtar. So Ruvain can't come to court and say, Shimon, you got to pay back your debt to Levi, which happens to be to me, when I signed on the bottom of the shtar, because I'm involved. So this is a similar kind of case, right? A person knows testimony in shtar ad shelo tipolo birusha, before it falls to him as a yerusha, and then it falls to him. So who eno yachol lekayim ktav yado? He can't go to court and say, oh yeah, I signed the shtar, because by doing that, he's basically advantaging himself. But other people can. So this seems to be the same kind of question, where a person can't do it for himself, but other people who come through his power can do it. This is my same point. My kushya. Why is that a problem? Maybe here too, it's not where they're coming to establish that it's a good signature. They already established that. They're just coming to verify that they already established that, in which case the witnesses are better than him. Ella ikashia kasha. We have the next case, which is very similar, but you'll see a fine difference. So we're up to the Aleph in the Maseret Hashas, at least in my Gemara. Let's say a person signs a document for somebody else, same case, right? Levi is lending money to Shimon, and Ruvain is sitting on the street, and he says, can you be my witness? And Ruvain signs the document. They're not related in any way, right? But it turns out that Ruvain and Levi then develop a relationship, and Ruvain becomes his son-in-law, right? So before he agreed to this, he was not his son-in-law, and now he became his son-in-law. So now, of course, he's pasul le'edut. He can't go to court and say, oh, I signed this document, it's my name, I verify it, because he's related. So it's the same kind of question, right? So he knew about testimony, he signed testimony before he became the son-in-law, nasa chotno, and then he became the son-in-law. In this case, hu eno me'id al ktav yado, he can't testify that, oh, this is my signature, because he's not allowed to testify. Aval cherim me'idin hu, right? Al cherim me'idin. But others can testify, and this seems to be quite contradictory, because hu eno mehemin, he himself is not believed to say that it's his. Aval achirim mehemni, but other people are believed, right, about his own testimony. So now, this is where we've had this question 2 times already, right? You gave the same answer both times, which is that's talking about a case where you already established it in Beit Din. Says Gemara, so chitema, if you're going to answer, I've been here twice already. Hachanami kigon shuchzak ktav yado Beit Din. This is why we brought this case, because in this case, Amar Rav Yosef bar Menyumi, Amar Rav Nachman, Rav Yosef bar Menyumi, in the name of Rav Nachman, said about this case, afal pisha lo huchzak ktav yado Beit Din, that you don't need to do that. So he very explicitly said that even if you've never previously established the veracity of the shtar in Beit Din, you come for the first time now, and the signature of the shtar, meaning the aid of the shtar, is now related to one of the people in the shtar. That person cannot say, oh, that's my signature, because the fact that you're establishing your signature means that you benefit someone who you're related to. But somebody else seems to be able to come and do that. And so therefore, this is a halacha where you couldn't do something yourself, but basically someone else can do it for you. And that seems to be an interesting halacha. We understand why it might be the case, but it seems like it's a sort of, kasha means a hard, but it's a difficult to understand case in Dinei Mamonut. Okay? Now says the Gemara, why is it so difficult to understand? Right? Where am I? My kushya. Right? Why in the world is that so hard? Maybe maybe Dilma Gzerat Melechi. Maybe it's not the reason that we don't trust someone who's a son-in-law is not because he's not trustworthy, in which case, if somebody else says it's a signature, he's still a son-in-law. So why is it more trustworthy? Maybe the whole reason we don't trust the son-in-law, right, is because it's a Gzerat Melech, which literally means a rule of the king, meaning essentially a halacha Moshe Misinai, Gzerat Melech, not Moshe, that what? That he is not believed to sign, but other people are believed. It's not because we think he lied. It's not that, oh, because he's related, we're afraid, we think it's likely that he signed onto this thing and falsified it. In which case, if you think he falsified it, how could somebody else saying, we know it's him, say it's any better? Maybe he falsified it and they know it's him, right? So it didn't prove anything by saying, you know it's him. He might have falsified it. But that's not the case. We don't actually think that someone, just because they're a son-in-law, right? If you're a Gazlan, sure, we think you lie about things. But if you're a son-in-law, we don't assume that. And if you don't explain it that way, think about Moshe and Aaron, right? I mean, think about, meaning it can't be true about everybody, right? You could say every Ganav is unreliable, but you can't say every son-in-law is unreliable, right? Think about Moshe and Aaron, right? For example, Moshe and Aaron lechutznam to their father-in-law, right? We always like to talk about Yitro, at least for Moshe, right? You think he can't sign on a star that involves Yitro. Let's say it had something to do with Judaism, right? And why? It's because we don't trust Moshe. Obviously, it's not the reason. It's Gzerat Melechu. It's a halacha. That's the way it is.
But then we have to say that it happened after we received the Torah in Sinai, not before.
It has to be after the Torah, correct?
Okay.
But that's correct. So it's Gzerat Melechu shelo yo'idu lahem, that he shouldn't testify, meaning that a son-in-law cannot testify for a father-in-law. And Achanami, Gzerat Melechu shelo yidu aktav yado lechot. No, it's the same thing. It's just it seems inappropriate, right? It seems wrong. It's not because we really think a son-in-law or a relative is lying about something. It's that it seems improper, right? And so it's not the way we're supposed to do things. And therefore, he's not believed, but it doesn't mean he's a liar, right? And therefore, if somebody else comes and says, we can verify this is his signature, we don't have to worry that, oh, maybe it is his signature, but he lied about the star and he wrote a different date than he's not supposed to do. He has a chazaka that he's an honest person. And so therefore, although he can't be the one to testify, someone else could testify for him. So therefore, this halakha is not so problematic. Ella says, let's go back to what we talked about last night or yesterday in the Gemara's terms, right? An earlier case, the Olam Kedarmina Meikara, it's really the first case we started with yesterday, which was actually the first line of today's daf. We read it yesterday, which is a son who sold property that belonged to his father in the lifetime of his father. And then that son died, right? Then the father died. And the grandson now comes and says to the buyer, giving back the property, my father sold you because I inherited it, right? And so he said that seems inappropriate because the son only inherits from his father, right? And the father sold it. So why should the son have more rights than his father had? And so he said yesterday, well, that's not so crazy because the son inherits from the grandfather, right? The son doesn't inherit from the father because the pasuk said, Tachat avotecha, tachat banecha, you avotecha, the other way. Tachat avotecha, you banecha. That in place of your father will be your sons. So your sons inherit your grandfather. So that seemed to be a pasuk which says that sons inherit their grandfather, not through their father. So therefore, why is it so problematic? It says the Gemara, because in fact, what it must be is the Olam Kedamina Meikar, 2 lines on the bottom. You're going to say, why is that so problematic? The pasuk says that the grandson inherits a grandfather. It says tachat avotecha yu banecha. That's not really a pasuk that means that you inherit. That's an asmachta. It's a pasuk in Tehillim, right? Ahu bibrachaktiv. That's a blessing. Not saying that a nice person, a tzaddik, as the Rashbam says, will have children and grandchildren that will inherit them. It's a nice message, but it's not a halachic principle that a grandson inherits his grandfather. And in reality, a grandson does not inherit his grandfather. A grandson only inherits his father. Now, sometimes his father's dead, but you can inherit through a dead father, of course, right? So, meaning it goes from the grandfather. So Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, in our case yesterday, Yitzchak sold the field. Yitzchak died, right? Avram died. The field then goes to Yitzchak, who's dead, and then goes to Yaakov through Yitzchak. But now you understand why when Yaakov goes to the people who bought it and say, give it back to me, and they can say to him, why should we give it back to you? We got it. You got it from your father. We got it from your father, right? So that's why it's kasher. Says the Gemara on the bottom line of Kuf Nun Tet Amud Aleph, can you really say that pasuk of Tachat Avotecha Yu Banecha is only referring to a bracha, meaning that it's not the halacha that a grandson inherits a grandfather, Aval inyan dina lo, but for halacha, per functional halacha, a grandson gets it from his father, who gets it from his father, this grandson's grandfather. But Tanya, what about the following case? And this, of course, is why we quoted all this last Amud, because we wanted to quote this Mishnah. It's actually a Mishnah, right? Hatznan. The Mishnah that we had a couple of days ago says the following. The Rashbam actually, not the Rashbam, Reina Chanano actually says that, the Rashbam quotes it, that's why this whole Gemara is in the wrong place, because it should have been after that first Mishnah, not after yesterday's Mishnah, right? Because this is the Mishnah we learned on Friday, not the Mishnah we learned on Shabbos. But this is where it is. What did the Mishnah we learned on Friday say? Let's not. What did the Mishnah say? Nafal habayit alavi alaviv, right? This was, remember, a complicated case of a son and a father, alavi alaviv. A son and his father are in a house, the house collapses, and they find the two bodies the next day, right? So that was one case. And the other case was alav yal morishav, on him and someone who gives him inheritance. Now, we don't know who that is, and that's what we're about to discuss. But let me pick a simple case. Let's say it's his uncle, right? So he is a father. Father could be dead, let's say. Rashbam always likes the names. The father's Yaakov. He's not alive. The uncle is Esav. Esav and his nephew, Yosef, we'll call him, are in the house together. The house collapses. And again, we don't know who died first, okay? Now remember that Yosef, in this case, the son, or the nephew in this case, owed money, right? So he owed a lot of money. And the question was he penniless when he died because he had no money? Or did he die second? So his father died first and gave him money, or his uncle died first and gave him money. So said the Mishnah yesterday or 2 days ago, let's say, Hayta alav k'tubat isha, let's say he owed a k'tuba to his wife, or bal chov, or he owed a debt. So then Yorshei ha'av, the Yorshim of the father say, Omrim haben meit rishon. They say, well, he died first, he's penniless, he doesn't owe anything anymore, he's dead, and all the money stayed with the father, and we get it now. Then the father died. But the one who owed money says, no. First, the father died, and all of his money went to his son. So the son's money is owed to us. So now, that was the Mishnah, right? In the Mishnah, we had a machloket, is it yachloku, is it Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel says, nechasim b'cheskatan. Anyways, says the Gemara, think about this, right? Who are these two relations, right? My love, who are your Ha'av, right? So, when we say the father and the son, or the morishav and the son, right? So when the father and the son die, right? So now there's two parties here. There's Yorshei Ha'av, the inheritors of the father, and there's the Bal Chov, right? The one who's owed money. Who are the Yorshei Ha'av? So the assumption is that when a father dies and a grandfather dies, the one who inherits them both is their grandson, right? Is the third generation. So that when we say my love, read that inside, my love, it stands to reason. Where am I? My love is 6 lines from the top, first word on the line. Yorshei Ha'av are b'nei, are their sons, meaning the sons of essentially the grandson in this case, right? And Morishav is Achi. When we say the case of Morishav, it means his brothers, right? So again, in this case that we just gave, right? So if the case was Yaakov and Yosef were in the house, then the inheritors are Yosef's sons, Yosef's children. If it's Yosef and his uncles, right? Yosef and Esav, then the inheritors of Yosef is not alive, assuming he has no sons. That's why we chose that case. And his uncle has other nephews, right? So Yosef has brothers. So then the Morishav would be Achi, would be his brothers. Now, why are we asking the question? If you say that a grandson does not inherit from a grandfather, right? That when it says, oh, a grandson inherits from a grandfather, it means that has a blessing. It's a nice thing, but it's not a halachic inheritance. So then I don't understand why the Mishnah makes any sense. Who cares if, remember, we said in the first case, the father, again, I'll give names again, Yosef owes money, and he doesn't have any money, right? He's in a house with his father, Yaakov. Yaakov has a lot of money. Yaakov and Yosef both die. And now Yosef's children, right? Say Menashe in this case, it inherits everything. The Baal Chov comes to Menashe and says to him, wait a second, you don't inherit everything. It could be that Yaakov died first. He left stuff to Yosef. Yosef had a lot of money, then he died, but Yosef had money he owed to us as debtors, right? As creditors. So says the Gemara, but why would it matter who died first? Because if you say, right, that a grandson, put it this way, a grandson never inherits a grandfather, then even if Yaakov, right? So remember, if what we're saying is this, right? If Yosef died first, then his son Menashe is very happy, right? Because Yosef had no money. When Yaakov then died, everything went to Menashe. But if it turned out that Yaakov died first, and Yaakov's money went to Yosef, Yosef owed his money to his creditors, right? So the Yorshim of the father, meaning the grandson, Menashe, really wants it to say that his father died first and that his grandfather died second, okay? Now they're both not alive, right? But says the Gemara, why is that true? Because if you claim that Menashe as a grandson never inherits his grandfather directly, it only happens through his father, then it doesn't matter who died first. Let's say Yosef died first, right? Then Yaakov died. When Yaakov died, the way Yaakov's inheritance money went to his grandson Menashe is through his father Yosef, who's dead, right? Meaning it went from Yaakov to a dead Yosef to a living Menashe. But if it had to stop in dead Yosef along the way, then the creditors should get it then. Why can't they collect when he's not alive? So if you claim that there's no halachic principle that a grandfather directly gives inheritance to a grandson, right, that it's only a bracha, the pasuk meant, not a halachic principle, then the Mishnah makes no sense. Why would it matter who died first? The only way a grandson gets property from a grandfather is through his father, right? Let's read that inside. Now, if you say, I'm reading a little bit again, lo matzi amar mikoach avoda abba katina, that a grandson can't say I'm inheriting directly from my grandfather. When it says in the Torah that a grandfather gives to a grandson, it doesn't mean literally Yerusha. It means bibrachaktiv. It means he gives him blessings and gives him nice things. So then ki meta ben v'achakach meta av ma'havi. So then why would it matter in the Mishnah if Yosef died first and then Yaakov died? It doesn't matter. Nemele Balchov, the Balchov can say to the grandson, to Menashe, Yushat Avuhun Kashakilna. Either way, whatever you have, Menashe, you got from your father. Even if your father wasn't alive, you got it from your father. And I want to take it because I got it from your father too. So this is where you're right. You know, in fact, if the Mishnah was talking about a grandson, then in fact, you're right. That would prove to us that a grandson inherits directly from a grandfather. But maybe the Mishnah is not referring to a grandson. Maybe the two cases in the Mishnah are Yorshei Ha'av are Achiv. Maybe one case in the Mishnah is actually the brother. So a man and his father died, and the Yerusha, he has no sons, we'll say, because if he had a son, it would not affect the whole thing. It goes to his brother. So if that case is the brother, what's the other case in the Mishnah? The Morishav might be referring to his uncle, Achidavua, his father's brother. So that's why it's a further relationship. So meaning the question in the house, as I just gave it to you, was either he's there with his brother or there with his uncle, not necessarily there with his son. So we can't prove it from there. So that is the end of that Gemara. The Rashbam does say that we, in fact, paskin this way, that a grandson gets it directly from a grandfather. But one last question before we almost finish our parak, which is Bo Mine Rav Shesha. They asked the following question from Rav Shesha. Ben, a son, Mahu Sheyirash Etimo Bakever. Can he inherit his mother who's not alive? Lahanchiol lachim min ha'av. To give the nachala to his brothers from his father. Remember that if a woman has possessions and she dies, it goes to her son, right? If she doesn't have a husband, but assuming she doesn't have a husband, right? It goes to her son. If she doesn't have a son, it goes to her father, right? If she doesn't have a father, it goes to her brothers, etc. We know how that works. So the thing is that a son's nachala, right? Even it goes to his brothers from his father, right? Because it doesn't go through his mother. So let's say, again, the case that the Rashbam always likes, which is this week's parsha, right? Rachel and Leah are co-wives, right? Whatever you call them, sister wives. They are sister, right? And they are married to one person. If Rachel dies, assuming she has no husband, Yaakov's not alive, her stuff goes to her son Yosef. When Yosef dies, if he had children, it would go to his children. But if he didn't have children, it would go to his brothers from his father, not his brothers from his mother, right? If he had a brother from his mother, but not the father, wouldn't get it. So it goes to a brother from the father. It goes to Reuven in this case. We got that? We're at the end. We have to have it all straight. So the question is, what
I'm
if the mother?
repeating in my head to see that, like,
No,
I'm
it's
following.
very confusing, no doubt. But the question here is, right? What if what if Yosef is not alive, right? So remember that you in a lot of Yerusha, it doesn't matter if you're alive, right? Like a father gives to a son even if he's not alive. But let's say Rachel had a son named Yosef. Yosef died, right? So had Yosef been alive, let's say Rachel died first, she would have left everything to Yosef. When Yosef died, it would go to his brother Reuven, right? With the same father, different mother. But let's say Yosef dies first. And Rachel's alive, she's a widow, she has money, then she dies, right? So you would have thought that it would go to her father and then her brothers, whatever, right? Because she has no people below her. But they asked her, Shesha, maybe we should say it goes to her dead son, Yosef. And after her dead son, Yosef, who obviously can't have it and has no children,
Brother.
it should go to his brothers, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's the question is Mahu, so let's read inside. Then can you have a son who's in the kever, who's in the grave, right? Mao sheyirashatimo bekever, when the son is dead, can dead son, inherit his mother from the grave in order not for him to get it, he's not alive, but lahadchil la'achim mina'av, to give nachla to his brothers from the father. So Rachel, of course, would give nothing to Reuven. She's not related to Reuven, right? But maybe the fact that she once had a son means that Reuven should get it. So said Rav Shesha to Nitua. In fact, there's a Mishnah, or a Braita at least, that clarifies this halacha. Let's read the Braita. It says the following: Ka'av shenishba umeit. Sorry, a father is it's Av shenishba kama. A father is captive, right? A father, unfortunately, today we know very well, unfortunately, what this means, right? So a father is taken as a captive, and he dies in captivity, sadly, right? And he also, well, we don't know when though, right? So this is the challenge here, right? We don't, and this is why all these cases are going to be the subject of what we're about to discuss. So the father was captured and he died, but we don't know when he died, okay? And then his son died at home, meaning we know his son died, but we don't know which one happened first, right? So basically, you have a situation where a father and his son both died. The father had plenty of money. It would have gone to his son had his son died second. The son eventually died, and we don't know what happened to that, where that money goes, right? Now, you're going to ask in a second, what do you mean? If they have a son, it doesn't matter who died first, right? Because whether the grandfather died or the father died, it goes to the grandson. So we'll see the case in a second. But let's read it inside. So, Tanitua, Ha'av shenishba, a father is taken captive and ultimately dies, but we don't know when. Umeit beno b'medina, and his son dies in the city, meaning we know when, but we don't know when in relation to the father. Or a ben shenishba, the son gets captive and he gets killed, and meit aviv b'medina. So in that case, where there's basically two people died, we don't know which one died first. It's like the house falling on them. Yorshei ha'av, yorshei ha'bal yachloku. The Yorshim of the father and the Yorshim of the son are split it up. I says, what's the case? If it's talking about like what we said, meaning the assumption is that there's a father and a son, and let's say they have a grandson, then what do you mean? Haininu Yorshiav, Haininu Yorshiav ben. There are no different Yorshiav and Yorshiav ben. They're the same people, right? A father and a son are the same Yerusha. They go to one person. Remember the cases we had in the Mishnah, the father and a son, were cases where you had a Balchov, or you had a third party. But if you're not talking about a third party, the Yerusha, it doesn't matter whether you get it from your father or your grandfather, it goes to the same people. It'll be the same Seder Yerusha. Ela lav hachikam. The case must be the following. Av shenishba, where you have a father who was captive and died, umeit ben bito b'medina. His grandson, but not his grandson through his son. His grandson through his daughter died in the Medina. So now there is a huge difference, right? Because the Yorshim of the grandfather include assuming he has no sons, right? So if a grandfather dies and he has a daughter only, the daughter is Yoreshim, and the daughter then gives it to her son, right? But if a grandson dies, it doesn't go to his grandfather because it never goes to his mother. It goes to his father, and his grandfather, so if he has no father, it'll go to his paternal grandfather, not his maternal grandfather. So this is Yerusha that goes in one way, but not the other, right? It goes to a daughter and then a grandson, but it doesn't go from a grandson to a mother and then a grandfather. So therefore, it matters a lot because there's Yorshim of the grandfather who are not Yorshim of the grandson, right?
But if he had brothers, it would go to his brothers. Or it wouldn't go to the brothers first.
It would go to the brothers if he had no, it would go to his brothers. But the question here would be, it depends on brothers from the mother, brothers from the father. But the question here would be, if the grandfather died first, then everything he had went to the grandson, and then it goes to the grandson's brothers. Let's say, right?
Yeah,
If the
that's what I
grandson
meant.
died first, then the grandfather's stuff just goes, to the grandfather's brothers or grandfather's other sons. Now, that's what you just said is the point of the Gemara, which is that clearly what you see from here is that if the grandson died first and he's not alive, it doesn't go to him anymore, which is the whole question we just had, right? Can a dead grandson be the Yerusha? You see here that you can't, but let's read that inside. Says the Gemara, it must be Allah Hachikamar. Av Shenishba, a grandfather, we call him Ab, but he's a grandfather who was captive and killed. Umeit ben bito b'medina, and his grandson through a daughter died, or the opposite, ben bito shenishba umeit avimo b'medina. V'lo yadin haiminayo mitparesha. Second wide line. We don't know which one died first, right? So then there's Yoshea Av, Yoshea ben Yachloko. Now, as you just pointed out, in Ita, if it's true what you asked of Sheshet, right? Can a grandson give it to his brothers in the grave? Nihi nami de ben bat de ben mate beresha. Even if the son, meaning the grandson, died first, it doesn't matter, right? Because l'irtula avua de ima bekivrei. He should inherit his grandfather in the grave, and his grandfather's stuff should go to him and then go to his brothers, right? V'lirtinu la'achva min avua. It should go to his brothers from his father. Elav shma mina. You see from here that if the grandson died first, then he no longer gets any Yerusha. And so you see that the rule is that if a grandson dies from a mother, basically a mother's son, then that Yerusha does not continue in the grave. Ein haben yoreshet imo bekever. A son does not inherit his mother or his grandfather through his mother in the grave. La'anchil la'achim me'av. Says Rav Acha bar Menyumi Labaya, again, fifth wide line. I have another proof for the same principle. Because the Breita says, what does it say? Actually, this was the Mishnah yesterday. Nafal habayit lav yal imo, right? Let's say a house falls on a boy and his mother, right? So elu ve'elu modim shiach loko. Everybody agrees that you split it up, right? And this was the same case we had yesterday. The mother had money, the son had no money. If the son died first, then the mother's money goes to her family. If the son died second, then the mother died first, all her money goes to her son, and then all goes to the son's family, which is his father's family, right? So said it's the same proof. If it's true that a son who's dead inherits his mother anyways, doesn't matter if he died first or second. Even if the son died first, right? The son will inherit his mother in the grave, and then it will go from him to it'll go to his brothers from his father. So it won't really matter. You see conclusively from these two Mishnayot, Ein haben yoreshet imo bekever la'anchil la'achim min ha'av shma mina. It's a proof. You don't do that. Since okay, we accept the proof from these Mishnayot, and of course this is why we quoted the Gemara here after the second Mishnah. But time mamai. But what is the reason? Right? There's plenty of nachala. Like I said, a son, Yaakov, what's his name? Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, right? If Yitzchak is dead and Avram then dies, it goes to Yaakov. Everybody agrees, even though Yitzchak is dead. So why isn't it the same? Why is it different with a father and a mother? It says where my taima. So taima mai Amar Abaya, because there's an interesting word, and we've quoted this many, many times. It says the word siba, hasava, if you recall. The nachala passes over beben. It says it by a son from his mother, and it says nemra siba bibal. It says it by a husband from a wife. So there's two ways, and we talked about this extensively before, right? That there's two ways that a woman gives Yerusha. One is to her children, and one is to her husband. Ma siba amur bebal, just like we learned earlier, and we said it was halacha Moshe Sinai, but we learned earlier that when it says hasava by a husband, ein habal yoreshet tishto bekever. A husband is not Yoresh's wife in the kever, meaning, now that meant something different then. It meant that even if a man was married to a woman, if she died and then inherited something, it doesn't go to him as her husband, right? Because he's no longer that status, right? So a husband is not Yoresh's wife bekever, and just like we know that halacha is that a husband is not Yoresh's wife bekever, so too ein haben af siba mura beben, so too a siba that it says by the son ein haben Yoreshet imo bekever lahanchil lachim min ha'av. So too, a son is not inheriting his mother when he's not alive in order to give it over to his brother from a father. Okay, so that is that. Now the next case, the Rashbam sort of boycotts, because he says, I already explained this earlier. So if you'll recall, this was a quote, a reverse of a Gemara that we had on Daf Chavtet, 130 pages ago, exactly. Chavtet. So we had it the opposite way. It's not so clear why we repeat it here. The Rashbam says because it's talking about chazakah, and we want to do chazakah, sort of like a bookend to the whole last 130 dapim. But basically, we're going to have two cases. Again, in Daf Chavtet and Lamed, we quoted in the opposite way. And we just have the other order. But two cases where there's a debate about who is the muchzak, who is the one who seems to have the original possession, and who is the one who's got to prove it. So what is the case? The first case is a person said to his friend, look, for $1 million, I'm going to sell you all of the property that I bought from Bar Sisan, right? I bought a huge, today this is very popular, right? You buy a lot, you buy, property, you don't buy a specific property, you buy a whole tranche of loans or something, right? Whatever. So I bought all this property from Bar Sisan. I'll sell it to you for a fixed amount of money. So I will sell you all of the nechasim of Bar Sisan. There was one field that he said was not included, but the name of the field was Havi Chada Ara. There was one piece of land, the Havi Mikri, the Bar Sisan. It was called the Bar Sisan land. And he said, oh, no, that's not included in the sale. In fact, that land is not from Bar Sisan. My family inherited it 500 years ago, and it's a Yerusha for me. It just happens to be called that. Seems a little convenient, right? So Amar Le, so Rav Nachman said that, one second, Ha lav de Bei Bar Sisan hu. Sorry, this is what he said to him. Amar Le, the seller, said to the buyer, Ha lav de Bei Bar Sisan hu. This actually is not land that I bought from Bei Bar Sisan, but I just call it that way. Ekrihu de Mikre de Bei Bar Sisan. Just happens to get that name. Maybe it's close by. People often call something adjacent, something like that. But I'm telling you, I didn't buy it from Bei Bar Sisan. So they came to Rav Nachman. Let's go to Rav Nachman. And Rav Nachman said, too bad. Ukma biyada dilo keach. You got to give it to the buyer. The buyer said, I'm buying all the land of Bar Sisan. This is called Bar Sisan. It's part of the sale. You got to prove it otherwise. So he gave it to the buyer. Amarle Rava Rav Nachman. Rava said to Rav Nachman, what? That seems crazy. Dina hachi. Is this really the halacha? Isn't hamotzi mechaver alav haraya? Right? If you should have to prove it. The buyer wants the field from the seller. You got to prove that you bought it. You can't take it away from the seller without proving it. So Rava disagreed with Rav Nachman. So that was one case. Says the Gemara, Virami Rava Rav Nachman. We have a second case where each one seems to take the opposite approach. What's the second case? This is the case we had in the beginning of Cheskara Batim. One person said to his friend, "My boy, I don't understand. What are you doing in this courtyard? Right? I notice you're laying here. Get out of this house. This is my house." And the guy says to him, "What are you talking about? I bought this house from you. And I've been living here for 3 years. I remember chazakah is 3 years. I've been living here for 3 years. I don't have a document that I bought the house anymore, but I don't have to keep it, as we learned in Cheskara Batim. It's 3 years. I can prove I've been here for 3 years." And he does. And here's 3 years of of receipts for my taxes or whatever, my internet, and so I have a chazakah. Amar Leis, the first guy says to him, "Yeah, sure, you've been here for 3 years. Ana b'shchune gavai havai. I was living on the inner room, meaning for 3 years I've been walking by you, sleeping out here on my couch, and I didn't say anything. I'm a nice guy, and now it's time to get out of here. My family's here." So remember that when a person is living there, you don't have a chazakah. Right? Because you assume, the whole point of chazakah is where someone's there, and if you don't say something, they're going to stay. But if I've been there the whole time, I can say, look, it's obviously my house. I wouldn't let someone just stay in my house, but if I didn't allow them to stay, I clearly didn't sell it to you, or I would have said something, right? So the fact is that you must be my guest. So you lose your chazakah when the owner is there, right? So now, up to the Kamei Rav Nachman. So now they came to Rav Nachman. Amalei, he said, Zil b'rorachilatcha. He said to the guy who was living there and said, I have a chazakah, you have to prove that your chazakah is a good chazakah. Sure, you were there for 3 years. We believe you. But if the other guy was living next to you for 3 years, then your chazakah doesn't count because he wouldn't have kicked you out because he would have said, whenever I want to get rid of him, I'll get rid of him, right? And so you have to clarify the conditions under which you were there. That's what Barwar Achilatcha means. Clarify how much you ate, meaning, was the guy there or not there? You'd have to prove that he wasn't there or that he had opportunities and didn't take them. So that's what Rav Nachman said to the person who said that he didn't have a shtar, but had a chazakah.
Okay.
In this case, too. So this seems to be the opposite, right? Because here he's putting the pressure on the one who says the second claim, you have to prove your claim. So Amrle Rav Nachman said again, Rav to Rav Nachman, Dina Hachi, is that in fact Nalacha? But Hamotzi Mechaver Lav Haraya. Why don't you have to prove, right? The inner guy says to the outer guy, I want to kick you out of here. If I want to kick you out of here, I got to prove to kick you out of here, right? So Hacha, I want to kick you out. Says Gemara, so it seems Kasha Rava, Rav Nachman. So each one seems to take the opposite position, right? Each one seems to switch what they were saying. Answers the Gemara, well, really, it's actually not the different because the Rava lo Kasha, and that's very easy to understand Rava's position, right? Rava consistently says that whoever had possession maintains possession, right? So if I sell property to you and you say, oh, you also sold me this extra house, I could say you have to prove it, right? So Hacha mocher koi b'nichsei. In the first case, the seller is the one who's living there. So if the buyer wants to include the extra field as nichsei the barbe meryan, he'd have to prove it. Hatam loker koi b'nichsei. But by the case of the chazakah, the guy's living in the courtyard. He can stay there until the seller or the original owner of the house proves that it's not his. But Rav Nachman, no kasha, so too with Rav Nachman. Because look, Hacha, first of all, in this case of Beibar Meryan, Kivan de Amar Le, sorry, I keep saying that, Beibar Sisan. Kivan de Amar Le de Beibar Sisan. Since I said to the person, the seller, I'm selling you all the Beibar Sisan. And this field is called Beibar Sisan, Nikra de Beibar Sisan. Right now, sure, the seller's got some crazy explanation that it's really not from Bar Sisan, it just happens to be called that. You got to prove that, right? It's very implausible. It's in his responsibility of the seller to prove that this is not from Beibar Sisan because it's got a name that seems to imply that it is, right? But Hacha, in the case of Chazakah, you have to remember, and this is a beautiful conclusion of the whole case that we've had, literally, last 150 daf almost, is that the way Chazakah works is not a proof that you own something. It's a replacement for a shtar, right? Because really, if you buy a field or buy a house, you have to have a contract that says you bought the house. Everybody knows that 10 years ago, I built this house. The guy living there for the last 5 years claims that he's living there not because he's squatting. Remember, if you go and say, I never bought the house from you, but I'm squatting here for 7 years, you never kicked me out and I own it, you don't get to stay, right? There's no Homestead Act in that. You have to say, I bought it from you, I lost the shtar, and I've been here for 5 years, so you can no longer claim that it's not mine because you would have never let me stay, right? But in that case, all you're basically proving is, quote unquote, that since you lived there for 3 years, you have a shtar. But you didn't prove what the shtar said, right? It says, let's read inside. Hacha lo yehei el denakit shtara. It's equivalent by living there for chazakah as if you're holding a shtar. But milo armina le, don't we say to a person who has a shtar, if I bring a document to you and say, I bought your house, you'll say to me, let's go to court and make sure it's a good document, right? Kiyem shtarcha v'kum b'nichsi. You have to be mekayim your shtar. You have to establish that the shtar means what it says. So says Rav Nachman, the same thing is true here. You have been there for 3 years, and that is a fact, right? So you basically have a shtar. But I claim that your shtar is not good because I've been living there too. So if you want to take I was the original owner. There's no doubt that Reuven originally owned this field. Shimon now says, I've been there for 5 years, but so what? If you want to prove that you bought it from me, you have to be Mekayim Yishtar and establish the facts. And until you do that, you are going to get kicked out. And that was what Rav Nachman said. And Hadran Alach Misha Mate. We finished that Bli Neder. We will tomorrow start the last parak, the last 2 weeks or so.
Wow.
Of Batra. It's been a long, long course of Get Pashut. So 15 more daf. Chodesh Tov. Chodesh Tov.
So what tov, chodesh tov. Thank you.
See you next week.
Bli neder.
Bli Neder.